Chapter 20 of Jane Eyre. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Elizabeth Klett. Jane Eyre by Charlotte Brontë. Chapter 20. I had forgotten to draw my curtain, which I usually did, and also to let down my window blind. The consequence was, that when the moon, which was full and bright, for the night was fine, came in her course to that space in the sky opposite my casement, and looked in at me through the unveiled panes, her glorious gaze roused me. Awaking in the dead of night, I opened my eyes on her disk, silver white and crystal clear. It was beautiful, but too solemn. I half rose, and stretched my arm to draw the curtain. Good God! What a cry! The night, its silence, its rest, was rent in twain by a savage, a sharp, a shrilly sound that ran from end to end of Thornfield Hall. My pulse stopped, my heart stood still, my stretched arm was paralyzed. The cry died and was not renewed. Indeed, whatever being uttered that fearful shriek could not soon repeat it; not the widest winged condor in the Andes could, twice in succession, send out such a yell from the cloud shrouding his eyrie. The thing delivering such utterance must rest ere it could repeat the effort. It came out of the third story, for it passed overhead. And overhead, yes, in the room just above my chamber ceiling, I now heard a struggle. A deadly one, it seemed from the noise, and a half-smothered voice shouted, "Help! help! help!" 3 times rapidly. "Will no one come?" it cried; and then, while the staggering and stamping went on wildly, I distinguished through plank and plaster, "Rochester! Rochester! for God's sake, come!" A chamber door opened, some one ran or rushed along the gallery, another step stamped on the flooring above, and something fell, and there was silence. I had put on some clothes, though horror shook all my limbs. I issued from my apartment. The sleepers were all aroused; ejaculations, terrified murmurs sounded in every room; door after door unclosed; one looked out, and another looked out; the gallery filled; gentlemen and ladies alike had quitted their beds, and "Oh, what is it?" "Who is hurt?" "What has happened?" "Fetch a light." "Is it fire?" "Are there robbers?" "Where shall we run?" was demanded confusedly on all hands. But for the moonlight, they would have been in complete darkness. They ran to and fro, they crowded together, some sobbed, some stumbled, the confusion was inextricable. "Where the devil is Rochester?" cried Colonel Dent. "I cannot find him in his bed." "Here, here," was shouted in return. "Be composed, all of you, I'm coming." And the door at the end of the gallery opened, and Mr. Rochester advanced with a candle; he had just descended from the upper story. One of the ladies ran to him directly; she seized his arm; it was Miss Ingram. "What awful event has taken place?" said she. "Speak, let us know the worst at once." "But don't pull me down or strangle me," he replied, for the Misses Eshton were clinging about him now, and the 2 dowagers, in vast white wrappers, were bearing down on him like ships in full sail. "All right, all's right," he cried. "It's a mere rehearsal of Much Ado about Nothing. Ladies, keep off, or I shall wax dangerous." And dangerous he looked; his black eyes darted sparks. Calming himself by an effort, he added, "A servant has had the nightmare, that is all. She's an excitable, nervous person. She construed her dream into an apparition, or something of the sort, no doubt, and has taken a fit with fright. Now then, I must see you all back into your rooms, for till the house is settled she cannot be looked after. Gentlemen, have the goodness to set the ladies the example. Miss Ingram, I am sure you will not fail in evincing superiority to idle terrors. Amy and Louisa, return to your nests like a pair of doves, as you are. Madame," to the dowagers, "you will take cold to a dead certainty if you stay in this chill gallery any longer." And so, by dint of alternate coaxing and commanding, he contrived to get them all once more enclosed in their separate dormitories. I did not wait to be ordered back to mine, but retreated unnoticed, as unnoticed I had left it. Not, however, to go to bed. On the contrary, I began and dressed myself carefully. The sounds I had heard after the scream, and the words that had been uttered, had probably been heard only by me, for they had proceeded from the room above mine; but they assured me it was not a servant's dream which had thus struck horror through the house, and that the explanation Mr. Rochester had given was merely an invention framed to pacify his guests. I dressed then to be ready for emergencies. When dressed, I sat a long time by the window looking out over the silent grounds and silvered fields, and waiting for I knew not what. It seemed to me that some event must follow the strange cry, struggle, and call. No. Stillness returned. Each murmur and movement ceased gradually, and in about an hour Thornfield Hall was again as hushed as a desert. It seemed that sleep and night had resumed their empire. Meantime the moon declined. She was about to set. Not liking to sit in the cold and darkness, I thought I would lie down on my bed, dressed as I was. I left the window, and moved with little noise across the carpet. As I stooped to take off my shoes, a cautious hand tapped low at the door. "Am I wanted?" I asked. "Are you up?" asked the voice I expected to hear, viz. My master's. "Yes, Sir." "And dressed?" "Yes." "Come out, then, quietly." I obeyed. Mr. Rochester stood in the gallery holding a light. "I want you," he said. "Come this way. Take your time, and make no noise." My slippers were thin. I could walk the matted floor as softly as a cat. He glided up the gallery and up the stairs, and stopped in the dark low corridor of the fateful third story. I had followed, and stood at his side. "Have you a sponge in your room?" he asked in a whisper. "Yes, Sir." "Have you any salts, volatile salts?" "Yes." "Go back and fetch both." I returned, sought the sponge on the washstand, the salts in my drawer, and once more retraced my steps. He still waited. He held a key in his hand. Approaching one of the small black doors, he put it in the lock. He paused, and addressed me again. "You don't turn sick at the sight of blood?" "I think I shall not. I have never been tried yet." I felt a thrill while I answered him, but no coldness and no faintness. "Just give me your hand," he said. "It will not do to risk a fainting fit." I put my fingers into his. "Warm and steady," was his remark. He turned the key and opened the door. I saw a room I remembered to have seen before. The day Mrs. Fairfax showed me over the house. It was hung with tapestry, but the tapestry was now looped up in one part, and there was a door apparent, which had then been concealed. This door was open. A light shone out of the room within. I heard thence a snarling, snatching sound, almost like a dog quarrelling. Mr. Rochester, putting down his candle, said to me, "Wait a minute," and went forward into the inner apartment. A shout of laughter greeted his entrance, noisy at first, and terminating in Grace Poole's own goblin ha! ha! She then was there. He made some sort of arrangement without speaking, though I heard a low voice address him. He came out and closed the door behind him. "Here, Jane," he said; and I walked round to the other side of a large bed, which, with its drawn curtains, concealed a considerable portion of the chamber. An easy chair was near the bed head. A man sat in it, dressed with the exception of his coat. He was still, his head leant back, his eyes were closed. Mr. Rochester held the candle over him. I recognized in his pale and seemingly lifeless face the stranger, Mason. I saw, too, that his linen on one side and one arm was almost soaked in blood. "Hold the candle," said Mr. Rochester, and I took it. He fetched a basin of water from the washstand. "Hold that," said he. I obeyed. He took the sponge, dipped it in, and moistened the corpse-like face. He asked for my smelling bottle, and applied it to the nostrils. Mr. Mason shortly unclosed his eyes. He groaned. Mr. Rochester opened the shirt of the wounded man, whose arm and shoulder were bandaged. He sponged away blood, trickling fast down. "Is there immediate danger?" murmured Mr. Mason. "Pooh! no, a mere scratch. Don't be so overcome, man, bear up. I'll fetch a surgeon for you now, myself. You'll be able to be removed by morning, I hope. Jane," he continued. "Sir?" "I shall have to leave you in this room with this gentleman, for an hour, or perhaps 2 hours. You will sponge the blood as I do when it returns. If he feels faint, you'll put the glass of water on that stand to his lips, and your salts to his nose. You will not speak to him on any pretext. And, Richard, it will be at the peril of your life if you speak to her. Open your lips, agitate yourself, and I'll not answer for the consequences." Again the poor man groaned. He looked as if he dared not move. Fear, either of death or of something else, appeared almost to paralyze him. Mr. Rochester put the now bloody sponge into my hand, and I proceeded to use it as he had done. He watched me a second, then saying, "Remember, no conversation," he left the room. I experienced a strange feeling as the key grated in the lock, and the sound of his retreating steps ceased to be heard. Here then I was in the third story, fastened into one of its mystic cells, night around me, a pale and bloody spectacle under my eyes and hands, a murderess hardly separated from me by a single door. Yes, that was appalling; the rest I could bear, but I shuddered at the thought of Grace Poole bursting out upon me. I must keep to my post, however; I must watch this ghastly countenance, these blue, still lips forbidden to unclose, these eyes now shut, now opening, now wandering through the room, now fixing on me, and ever glazed with the dullness of horror. I must dip my hand again and again in the basin of blood and water, and wipe away the trickling gore. I must see the light of the unsnuffed candle wane on my employment, the shadows darken on the wrought antique tapestry round me, and grow black under the hangings of the vast old bed, and quiver strangely over the doors of a great cabinet opposite, whose front, divided into 12 panels, bore in grim design the heads of the 12 apostles, each enclosed in its separate panel as in a frame, while above them at the top rose an ebon crucifix and a dying Christ. According as the shifting obscurity and flickering gleam hovered here or glanced there, it was now the bearded physician, Luke, that bent his brow, now St. John's long hair that waved, and anon the devilish face of Judas, that grew out of the panel, and seemed gathering life and threatened a revelation of the arch traitor, of Satan himself in his subordinate's form. Amidst all this, I had to listen as well as watch, to listen for the movements of the wild beast or the fiend in yonder side den. But since Mr. Rochester's visit, it seemed spell-bound. All the night I heard but 3 sounds at 3 long intervals: a step creak, a momentary renewal of the snarling canine noise, and a deep human groan. Then my own thoughts worried me. What crime was this that lived incarnate in this sequestered mansion, and could neither be expelled nor subdued by the owner? What mystery that broke out now in fire and now in blood, at the deadest hours of night? What creature was it that, masked in an ordinary woman's face and shape, uttered the voice, now of a mocking demon, and anon of a carrion-seeking bird of prey? And this man I bent over, this commonplace, quiet stranger, how had he become involved in the web of horror? And why had the fury flown at him? What made him seek this quarter of the house at an untimely season, when he should have been asleep in bed? I had heard Mr. Rochester assign him an apartment below. What brought him here? And why now was he so tame under the violence or treachery done him? Why did he so quietly submit to the concealment Mr. Rochester enforce? Why did Mr. Rochester enforce this concealment? His guest had been outraged, his own life on a former occasion had been hideously plotted against, and both attempts he smothered in secrecy, and sank in oblivion. Lastly, I saw Mr. Mason was submissive to Mr. Rochester, that the impetuous will of the latter held complete sway over the inertness of the former. The few words which had passed between them assured me of this. It was evident that, in their former intercourse, the passive disposition of the one had been habitually influenced by the active energy of the other. Whence then had arisen Mr. Rochester's dismay when he heard of Mr. Mason's arrival? Why had the mere name of this unresisting individual, whom his word now sufficed to control like a child, fallen on him, a few hours since, as a thunderbolt might fall on an oak? Oh, I could not forget his look and his paleness when he whispered, "Jane, I have got a blow. I have got a blow, Jane." I could not forget how the arm had trembled which he rested on my shoulder, and it was no light matter which could thus bow the resolute spirit, and thrill the vigorous frame of Fairfax Rochester. "When will he come? When will he come?" I cried inwardly, as the night lingered and lingered, as my bleeding patient drooped, moaned, sickened, and neither day nor aid arrived. I had again and again held the water to Mason's white lips, again and again offered him the stimulating salts. My efforts seemed ineffectual; either bodily or mental suffering, or loss of blood, or all 3 combined, were fast prostrating his strength. He moaned so, and looked so weak, wild, and lost, I feared he was dying, and I might not even speak to him. The candle, wasted at last, went out. As it expired, I perceived streaks of grey light edging the window curtains. Dawn was then approaching. Presently I heard Pilot bark far below, out of his distant kennel in the court yard. Hope revived. Nor was it unwarranted. In 5 minutes more, the grating key, the yielding lock, warned me my watch was relieved. It could not have lasted more than 2 hours. Many a week has seemed shorter. Mr. Rochester entered, and with him the surgeon he had been to fetch. "Now, Carter, be on the alert," he said to this last. "I give you but half an hour for dressing the wound, fastening the bandages, getting the patient down stairs and all." "But is he fit to move, Sir?" "No doubt of it. It is nothing serious. He is nervous, his spirits must be kept up. Come, set to work." Mr. Rochester drew back the thick curtain, drew up the Holland blind, let in all the daylight he could; and I was surprised and cheered to see how far dawn was advanced, what rosy streaks were beginning to brighten the east. Then he approached Mason,